Clench your fist right now, as hard as you can. Hold it for 10 seconds, count them, and then open your hand completely. Let every finger go limp at once. Your hand is now more relaxed than it was before you clenched it. Not back to baseline, below baseline. The muscles have settled past their resting state into a depth of softness that trying to relax cannot reach. The blood flow through your fingers has surged. You may feel warmth that was not there before. Your autonomic nervous system detected the spike in tension, interpreted it as a physiological event requiring compensation, and produced a parasympathetic response that overshot past your starting point into a depth of calm you did not possess before you squeezed. Harder squeeze. Deeper calm. Now multiply that by every muscle in your body, because the full body version produces a systemic autonomic reset that no breathing exercise, no meditation technique, and no deliberate attempt to relax can replicate. The tension is not the opposite of the relaxation. The tension is the prerequisite. Think about what happens inside your muscles during those 10 seconds, because the chemistry that builds inside the tissue is what triggers the reflex that produces the calm. When your muscles contract at high intensity, metabolic waste accumulates in the tissue: hydrogen ions, phosphate, potassium, adenosine. The waste builds quickly because the blood vessels inside the contracting muscle are compressed shut by the surrounding tissue. At maximum contraction, blood flow through the muscle approaches zero, the vessels are physically crushed. Oxygen delivery stops. Waste has nowhere to go. Sensory nerve fibers embedded in your muscle tissue, specialized sensors that monitor the chemical environment, detect the accumulating waste and fire. The signal travels to the cardiovascular control centers in your brainstem and produces a sympathetic response. Heart rate increases by 10 to 20 beats per minute. Blood pressure rises by 10 to 30 points. Your adrenal glands release a small burst of stress hormones. Your body enters a brief, voluntary, controlled version of the fight or flight response, identical in autonomic profile to a sudden fright, but generated deliberately by your muscles. 10 seconds is the window, less than 10 and the waste concentration has not reached the threshold that maximally stimulates the sensory fibers. More than 10 adds effort without increasing the reflex that follows. 10 seconds puts the metabolic signal at its effective peak. You may find that 10 seconds feels longer than expected. The instinct to release arrives around second 7. The burning sensation in the contracted muscles is the accumulating waste doing exactly what the mechanism requires, not a warning to stop. Holding through 10 is the practical difficulty of the technique. The reflex fires when the metabolic signal crosses threshold, and threshold arrives in the final 3 seconds. Here is the reflex, because what happens in the first 3 seconds after release is not relaxation. It is a cardiovascular overcorrection. When you release, the sympathetic drive disappears instantly. But your blood pressure is still elevated. The pressure sensors in your aortic arch and carotid arteries detect the elevation and trigger a compensatory parasympathetic surge through your vagus nerve. Heart rate drops, blood pressure drops, the system corrects. But it overcorrects. Heart rate falls below your pre-contraction baseline. Blood pressure settles below where it started. Your nervous system has overshot into a parasympathetic state deeper than your resting state, a depth you did not possess before you tensed. Your conscious mind controls the contraction intensity. The reflex determines the rebound depth, and the depth scales with the intensity. The reflex does not consult you. Because the technique produces a deliberate 10-second blood pressure elevation before the rebound, it is worth pausing here before the mechanism continues. If you take beta blockers, the medication blunts the sympathetic spike. The technique still works, but the rebound is smaller because the peak is smaller. If you have uncontrolled hypertension, a cardiac arrhythmia, a diagnosed aneurysm, have had recent cardiac surgery, or have been advised against isometric exertion or breath holding under load, the full body version is not the form for you. A single arm contraction produces a proportionally smaller spike and a proportionally smaller rebound. The mechanism scales to whatever intensity is safe for your cardiovascular system to produce. Cardiovascular reflex accounts for the heart rate drop and the blood pressure drop. It does not account for why the muscles themselves feel softer after release than they felt before contraction, softer than you could make them through any amount of deliberate relaxation. That softness comes from a second reflex, operating simultaneously through a completely different sensor, and the clearest place to see it is the jaw. Your jaw muscles are innervated by the trigeminal nerve, the largest cranial nerve, carrying sensory and motor information from the face, the teeth, the jaw, and the scalp directly to the brainstem. Unlike limb muscles, which signal through the spinal cord, the trigeminal carries jaw muscle signals directly to the brainstem through a cranial pathway. The shorter route produces a trigeminal autonomic reflex that cardiology recognizes clinically. Jaw and facial manipulation during sinus and dental surgery can trigger measurable heart rate changes through this circuit, the trigeminal cardiac reflex, documented in surgical settings for decades. The autonomic consequence of jaw contraction and release is disproportionately large relative to the muscle mass involved. You have felt this without knowing the anatomy. The relief of unclenching a tightly held jaw is qualitatively different from the relief of unclenching a fist, deeper, more systemic, reaching into the head and the neck and the chest in a way that releasing a hand does not. The jaw carries an autonomic weight that limb muscles do not possess. Connection runs in the other direction as well. Stress produces jaw clenching involuntary, sustained, often nocturnal. You grind your teeth during sleep. You clench your jaw during difficult conversations, during tense driving, during anxious waiting. The clenching is not a habit. It is a sympathetic expression through the trigeminal pathway, the brainstem's stress response recruiting the jaw muscles through the cranial nerve connection. The jaw clenches because the autonomic system is activated, and the clenched jaw feeds back into the autonomic system through the trigeminal afferents, maintaining the activation. The loop is self-reinforcing. Stress clenches the jaw. The clenched jaw signals the brainstem that stress is present. The brainstem maintains the stress response. Dentists see the consequence as nocturnal bruxism, worn tooth surfaces, cracked molars, morning jaw pain. The standard treatment is a night guard, which protects the teeth without interrupting the trigeminal autonomic circuit that clenched them. The mechanism that breaks that loop is the second reflex, the one operating in every contracting muscle, not just the jaw. Embedded in the tendon where each muscle attaches to bone is a tension sensor called the Golgi tendon organ. Its purpose is protective. When the muscle generates force approaching the threshold where the tendon or the muscle fiber could tear, the Golgi tendon organ fires and triggers a reflex inhibition of the motor neurons driving that muscle. The muscle is forced to relax, not by your decision, but by a spinal reflex that overrides the contraction command to prevent injury. Maximum voluntary contraction drives the Golgi tendon organs in every contracting muscle to near maximum firing rate, reporting to the spinal cord that every major muscle group is under high load simultaneously. When you release, the Golgi tendon organ signal persists briefly. The reflex inhibition continues for several seconds after the voluntary contraction has ended. The motor neurons that were driving each muscle are suppressed at the spinal level. The muscle relaxes past its normal resting tone, because the neurons that maintain resting tone are temporarily inhibited by a reflex that operates below consciousness and below voluntary control. In the jaw, this reflex inhibition is what breaks the stress clench signal stress loop. Maximal voluntary jaw clench for 10 seconds harder than the stress-driven involuntary clench, followed by complete release. The Golgi tendon organs in the jaw muscles trigger reflex inhibition of the motor neurons. The jaw muscles relax below their stress-driven baseline. The trigeminal afferents report the relaxation to the brainstem. The brainstem's stress maintenance signal weakens. The loop is interrupted. The instruction to clench the jaw during the full-body contraction is not optional. It is the component that accesses the trigeminal autonomic pathway and breaks the jaw tension anxiety loop that limb contraction alone does not reach. Golgi tendon organ reflex also explains something most people have experienced and never understood: why stretching after exercise produces a different quality of relaxation than stretching without prior contraction. A stretch performed on a cold, uncontracted muscle meets the muscle's resting tone. The stretch elongates the tissue against the baseline motor neuron firing that maintains postural tension. A stretch performed immediately after intense contraction meets a muscle whose motor neurons are reflexively inhibited. The Golgi tendon organs have suppressed the firing, the resting tone is reduced, and the stretch encounters less resistance. The muscle yields further. the relaxation feels deeper. Massage therapists and physiotherapists use this principle: contract the muscle, then stretch it without always naming the reflex that makes it work. The contraction-release cycle activates it across every muscle simultaneously rather than one muscle at a time. That dual reflex architecture, cardiovascular reset through arterial pressure sensors, muscular reset through tendon tension sensors, both triggered by one contraction, both producing depth beyond voluntary reach, is the overlap between two independent protective reflexes that I did not realize was sitting in every muscle group until the anatomy made it visible. The muscular dimension of the ceiling was identified in the 1930s at the University of Chicago, when Edmund Jacobson's electromyography research showed that subjects could not fully relax a muscle through intention alone. Residual contraction persisted below the threshold of awareness in every muscle group tested. The subjects genuinely could not feel the remaining tension. Voluntary relaxation has a ceiling set by your ability to detect what remains. The contraction-release cycle breaks through the ceiling because the Golgi tendon organ reflex does not depend on your awareness. It suppresses motor neurons through a spinal circuit that operates below consciousness. If you have ever lain in bed feeling tense but unable to locate the tension, if your body was holding something you could not find and could not release, the contraction-release cycle resolves it. You do not need to find the hidden tension. You contract everything maximally, including whatever muscles are carrying the invisible load, and both reflexes release everything below the ceiling when you let go. Two reflexes are the autonomic half of the story. The other half is what happens inside the tissue during the 10 seconds of compression, because one contraction that drives the sympathetic spike also compresses the blood vessels running through the muscle, and the vascular consequences of that compression arrive in 1 3-second window as the reflex rebounds. Contraction compresses the blood vessels inside your muscles shut. Oxygen delivery stops. Your vascular lining responds to the oxygen deprivation by producing vasodilating signals, nitric oxide, prostaglandins, adenosine molecular signals, commanding the vessels to widen. But the vessels cannot respond while the muscle is contracted. The signals accumulate for 10 seconds with nowhere to go. Release. Compression lifts. 10 seconds of accumulated vasodilating signals hit the vessel walls simultaneously. The vessels dilate beyond their resting diameter. Blood surges through the previously compressed tissue at several times the normal rate, reactive hyperemia. The warmth spreading through your hands and feet is elevated blood flow, delivering oxygen to tissue that was briefly deprived, clearing the metabolic waste that drove the sympathetic activation, and exercising the vascular lining through a compression dilation cycle that maintains vessel elasticity and responsiveness. Warmth has a specific significance if you are over 45, with chronically cold hands or feet, because cold extremities in the absence of disease often indicate reduced resting vascular tone. The blood vessels in your hands and feet are partially constricted at baseline, not from disease but from the gradual reduction in vascular responsiveness that age produces. The vessels are stiffer. They dilate less readily. Resting blood flow to your extremities is lower than it was at 30, and the cold hands you notice every evening are the subjective experience of reduced peripheral perfusion. The contraction-release cycle forces the vessels through a full compression dilation cycle that exceeds anything resting circulation provides. Regular cycles maintain the vascular responsiveness that disuse allows to decline. 10 seconds of compression also affects your chest. During full body contraction, you hold your breath involuntarily. Your chest and abdominal muscles contract along with everything else, locking the diaphragm. Pressure inside your chest rises. When you release, the breath rushes in deep, sudden, involuntary. The pressure inside your chest drops. Blood that was held back by the elevated chest pressure floods into your heart. The pressure sensors detect the surge and trigger a parasympathetic pulse through the vagus nerve, a second vagal activation layered on top of the baroreceptor-mediated overshoot that was already in progress. The exhale that follows, typically a long, involuntary sigh, activates the vagal pathway through the respiratory mechanism the sigh discussion described. 4 mechanisms from 1 10-second contraction: cardiovascular, muscular, vascular, respiratory. Second question opens here because the mechanism explains why the technique works for someone who is calm. It does not yet explain why the technique works better during anxiety than during calm, and the anxiety application is where the proportional math produces its most consequential result. Acute anxiety means your sympathetic nervous system is already activated, heart rate elevated, blood pressure high, muscles tense. Every conventional relaxation technique asks you to override this state from the top down. Breathing exercises ask you to slow your breath against a sympathetic drive that is accelerating it, requiring sustained effort for 10 to 20 minutes. Meditation asks you to calm your thoughts against an amygdala that is generating them, requiring cognitive resources that anxiety has compromised. The planning region of your brain, the region that sustains deliberate effort, is partially suppressed during acute anxiety because your threat detection system has redirected resources toward survival processing. The tool you need to relax is the tool anxiety has disabled. Contraction release works with the sympathetic state rather than against it. You are already tense. The technique says, be more tense, maximally, voluntarily. Add your full effort on top of the anxiety-driven contraction. The combined spike anxiety plus voluntary contraction is larger than either alone. The rebound responds to the combined elevation, pushing past the anxiety-driven baseline into a parasympathetic state the anxiety was preventing you from reaching. The anxiety's own energy fueled the spike that produced the rebound that resolved it, and the technique required no cognitive sophistication, only squeezing. Squeezing is available to every brain state, including panic. That reversal, the anxiety contributing to the spike that produced the reflex that resolved the anxiety, the problem becoming the fuel for its own solution, is the pattern that made 3 a.m. panic look like its own interruption to me. Speed of this intervention is worth naming because it separates contraction release from every other autonomic technique on a single measurable dimension. A breathing protocol takes 3 to 5 minutes to produce measurable autonomic shift. Progressive muscle relaxation takes 15 to 20 minutes, working through each muscle group individually. Meditation requires sustained attention across 10 to 20 minutes. Contraction release produces measurable heart rate reduction and blood pressure reduction within 30 seconds of a single cycle. The speed is not a compromise in depth. It is the consequence of using reflexes rather than voluntary override, and reflexes operate in seconds because the anatomy evolved to resolve sympathetic spikes in time windows where minutes were not available. Evolutionary logic is worth pausing on because the reflex did not evolve to produce calm, it evolved to resolve physical exertion. Your ancestors ran, climbed, lifted, carried, and fought, all activities that produced the exact metabolic sympathetic spike that maximum voluntary contraction now produces. When the exertion ended, when the predator was escaped, the load set down, the fight resolved, the body needed to return to rest quickly. A species that took 15 minutes to recover from every sympathetic spike would have been at a survival disadvantage compared to a species that recovered in 30 seconds. The baroreceptor overshoot and the Golgi tendon inhibition evolved as recovery mechanisms for a body that expected sympathetic spikes to happen regularly and needed to clear them fast. Modern life removed the physical exertion but preserved the sympathetic spikes. The 3 a.m. panic, the work meeting anxiety, the driving tension, these produce an equivalent sympathetic activation as a fight or a sprint without the contraction that normally accompanied it. Your body is experiencing the sympathetic surge without the muscular work. The recovery reflexes that evolved to follow muscular work are not triggered by anxiety alone, because anxiety does not compress the blood vessels, does not accumulate waste in the muscles, does not load the Golgi tendon organs. The sympathetic spike is present. The reflex architecture that normally resolves it is not activated. The result is sustained sympathetic tone with no natural off switch. Voluntary contraction release supplies the missing input. You provide the muscular work that modern anxiety does not. The reflexes that evolved to follow physical exertion fire because they encounter the physiological signature they were designed to respond to. You are not producing a new intervention, you are triggering an ancient one that your environment stopped providing. The 10-second squeeze is a simulation of the effort your body evolved to expect after every sympathetic surge. This explains why the technique feels intuitive on the first attempt and works without instruction. The reflexes are already present. They are already wired. They just need the input. One specific application at bedtime that the sleep literature supports because contraction release reduces sleep onset latency through a mechanism that operates independently of the thermoregulatory pathway, the hot bath. Discussion described. If you lie in bed, unable to fall asleep, muscles tense from the day, mind active with the rumination that quiet evenings produce, heart rate slightly elevated from the residual, sympathetic tone. The evening's worries produce the contraction-release cycle addresses all three components simultaneously. The cardiovascular reflex drops heart rate below your pre-contraction resting rate. The Golgi tendon organ reflex releases the residual muscle tension that you are carrying below awareness, the tension in your shoulders, your jaw, your lower back that you have been lying on for 20 minutes without being able to locate or release. The respiratory reset triggers 2 rounds of vagal activation through the post-contraction sigh. 2 cycles in bed, under 2 minutes total. The cumulative effect is a body state measurably closer to the autonomic profile of sleep onset: lower heart rate, lower blood pressure, reduced muscle tone, parasympathetic dominance. The hot bath works through thermoregulation, core temperature decline, opening the sleep gate, requiring 90 minutes of lead time. Contraction release works through autonomic shift, parasympathetic rebound, and muscular inhibition, requiring 90 seconds. The 2 mechanisms are independent and additive. If you take a bath 90 minutes before bed and perform 2 contraction release cycles after lying down, you have activated 2 sleep onset pathways through different physiology. Bedtime application has one practical note: the contraction should be performed lying on your back with your body fully supported. The full body squeeze in this position involves pressing your back into the mattress, clenching your fists against the sheets, squeezing your legs together, and tightening your abdomen. Identical muscles, identical intensity, identical 10 seconds. The release into a supported surface is qualitatively different. From a standing release, gravity assists the relaxation rather than requiring postural correction. The heaviness that follows the release feels amplified because the mattress receives the weight your muscles just dropped. The body sinks. The muscles yield. The warmth arrives. And the respiratory sigh that follows is the last voluntary act before the autonomic state the reflexes produced carries you towards sleep. There is a second application. Most people do not consider using the technique before a known stressor rather than after. Medical procedures, dental appointments, difficult conversations, public speaking, long drives in bad weather, phone calls you have been avoiding. The standard approach is to endure the stressor and recover afterward. The alternative is to perform 2 contraction release cycles in the 10 minutes before the event, arriving at the stressor with heart rate below your normal baseline, blood pressure below baseline, and muscle tone reduced below the awareness ceiling. Pre-stressor application works through a different mechanism than the post-stressor application. Post-stressor, you are using the reflex to resolve an elevated state. Pre-stressor, you are using the reflex to lower your starting baseline before the stressor arrives. The stressor then elevates you from a lower starting point, and your peak sympathetic activation during the event is correspondingly lower. You do not prevent the stress response. You reduce the altitude from which it has to climb. A phone call that would have spiked your heart rate to 100 beats per minute from a resting baseline of 75 spikes to 95 from a post-contraction baseline of 70. The stress is still present. The peak is lower. The recovery afterward is faster because the peak was lower. This application is particularly useful if you know your own stress pattern, if you recognize that certain situations reliably produce anxiety in you and that the anxiety arrives at predictable times. The afternoon conversation with a difficult family member, the drive to a specific location, the waiting room before a specific kind of appointment. 2 cycles before the event shifts the baseline. The event arrives at a body that is physiologically calmer than it would have been, and the subjective experience of the event is correspondingly modulated because subjective stress tracks physiological state. You feel less anxious partly because you are less physiologically activated. The technique produces the physiology. The physiology influences the experience. If you carry chronic low-grade tension, the headache that is not quite a headache, the back stiffness that is not quite pain, the jaw ache that arrives every evening from a day of unconscious clenching, 2 contraction release cycles may address both the tension and the discomfort simultaneously. The Golgi tendon organ releases the residual muscle tension that was producing the discomfort. The jaw release through the trigeminal pathway addresses the cranial dimension of the tension. The baroreceptor reflex shifts the autonomic state that was maintaining the sympathetic drive behind the tension. The softening of whatever low-grade pain the body was carrying is the direct consequence of releasing the muscle tension that was generating the pain signal in the first place. Lying down, sitting, or standing position does not matter. Clench both fists, squeeze both arms. Press your shoulders toward your ears. Clench your jaw teeth together, full contraction. Tighten your abdomen, squeeze your glutes, tense your thighs, point or flex your feet. Everything at maximum intensity for 10 seconds. Count them. Then release everything simultaneously. Let your arms drop, let your jaw fall open, let your shoulders collapse, let the breath rush in on its own. Let the exhale leave as a long involuntary sigh. Here's what arrives and when, because the mechanisms do not arrive simultaneously. They arrive in sequence, each one observable if you know what to notice. First 3 seconds, the breath. The deep involuntary inhalation followed by the long sigh. This is the respiratory reset, the post-breath hold recovery activating the vagal pathway. You will not decide to sigh. The sigh will happen. The lungs emptied during the contraction, the diaphragm was locked, and the release produces an inhalation that is deeper and more sudden than any breath you would take voluntarily. Seconds 3 to 10, the warmth. Spreading through your hands first, then your forearms, then your feet. The warmth is reactive hyperemia, blood surging through vessels that were compressed for 10 seconds. The warmth is most noticeable in the hands because the hand has the highest density of blood vessels per square centimeter and the greatest subjective sensitivity to temperature change. Seconds 10 to 20, the heaviness. Your limbs feel heavier than they felt before the contraction. The heaviness is the Golgi tendon organ reflex motor neuron inhibition producing muscle relaxation below your awareness ceiling. The heaviness is most noticeable in the arms and the jaw, the muscles where you carried the most residual tension before the contraction. The jaw, in particular, will feel different, looser, softer, the trigeminal autonomic pathway producing a cranial dimension of release that the limbs do not provide. Seconds 20 to 60, the settling. Heart rate drops below your pre-contraction baseline. Blood pressure settles below where it started. The cardiovascular reflex reaches its full expression in this window. If you are monitoring with a wrist device, you will see the heart rate number settle 2 to 5 beats below where it was before you started. If you are not monitoring, you will feel it as a quieting, a sense that the cardiovascular urgency present during the contraction has resolved into something calmer than neutral. By 60 seconds, all the mechanisms have delivered their effects. The cumulative state is what Jacobson spent decades studying, a depth of physiological relaxation that voluntary effort cannot produce, delivered in under a minute through reflexes that operate below consciousness. Repeat once. The second cycle starts from the lowered baseline the first produced. The rebound pushes deeper. 2 cycles is sufficient for most applications: routine calm, sleep onset, or acute anxiety. By the third cycle, diminishing returns arrive as the parasympathetic baseline is already deep. 10 seconds of tension. 3 seconds of release. 4 mechanisms from 1 contraction. The tension was never the problem. The tension is what the reflexes require.